things are happening as we move into the next transition phase, a phase that was planned long ago, where the whole world is to be brought into a new economy and a new regimented way of living from birth to death, watched to the grave by cameras, all your information collected, electronic information, and stored in data banks. They've announced, I think, in Britain, that they'll keep all information, all telephone calls, everything up to 10 years or more. And that will happen elsewhere if it's not already been done. Most of this stuff has already been done anyway. And getting back to this book, and I'll mention the name of it near the end of the show. Otherwise, I'll be running off to look it up on the internet. You won't hear what I have to say. So I'm giving you a shortcut to the book, so just listen, and it's quite interesting. The OSS was the precursor of the CIA. It was set up during World War II as a combination of Britain's Secret Service and the United States' new Secret Service. They worked out of Chatham House, which is the head office, that's the main quarters of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, another private organization, so we're told. Personally, I don't think so. The evidence points to the fact that the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the CFR are basically a secret service unto themselves, working for the establishment. And this book actually goes into some of this. And if you can actually read it and see all the names of the people who belong to it, it'll give credence to what I'm talking about. It says here, governed by legislation which prohibited little and countenanced virtually anything, OSSers, or Ossers, sometimes they call themselves in The Wizard of Oz, found themselves roving wartime Europe like latter-day proconsuls. The first OSS man to reach Bucharest after the German withdrawal in autumn 1944 became a regular guest at meetings of the Romanian cabinet and boasted to his colleagues, "Before they vote on anything, they ask me what I think. They pass all my laws unanimously. I never thought running a country was so easy, but running a country was precisely what most OSSers were brought up to do." Recruiting from the heart of America's corporate, political, academic, and cultural establishment, Donovan had assembled an elite corps which hailed from America's most powerful institutions and families. Members of the Mellon family held espionage posts in Madrid, London, Geneva, Paris. Paul Mellon worked for the Special Operations Executive in London. His sister Ailsa, once known as the world's richest woman, was married to his commanding officer, Chief of OSS London, David Bruce, son of a US senator and a millionaire in his own right. J.P. Morgan's sons were both in the OSS. The families Vanderbilt, DuPont, Archibald, Standard Oil, Ryan. He was also in Equitable Life Insurance. Wheel, Macy's department store, Whitney were all represented in the ranks of Donovan's secret army. This is far from having risked their future status. Their period in the OSS enhanced their reputations and offered another network to combine with the old school tie that had brought them together in the first place. So there was also personal ambitions involved too. This and their initiation into illegality and unorthodoxy was to provide a rich resource for the CIA, because the OSS transformed into the CIA. In fact, the OSS was disbanded by President Truman, who said he didn't want another Gestapo running the United States of America. To continue here, it says, it was this historic elite, the Ivy Leaguers, who cast their influence over America's boardrooms, academic institutions, major newspapers and media, law firms and government, who now stepped forward to fill the ranks of the fledgling agency. Many of them hailed from a concentration in Washington of 100 or so wealthy families known as the Cave Dwellers, who stood for the preservation of the Episcopalian and Presbyterian values that had guided their ancestors. Schooled in the principles of robust intellect, athletic prowess, politesse, and solid Christian ethics, they took their example from men like the Reverend Endicott Peabody, whose Groton School ran along the lines of Eton, Harrow and Winchester was the alma mater of so many national leaders. Trained in the Christian virtues and the duties of privilege, they emerged believing in democracy but wary of unchecked egalitarianism. Reversing Willy Brandt's celebrated declaration, "We are the elected of the people, not the elect," this was the elect who had not been elected. And then on page 96 of this particular book, and this goes into culture because this is what it was all about. Most of the Cold War had nothing to do with espionage as we think of it. It was to do with a battle for people's minds. Both the Soviets, or the Soviet elite, and the elite of the US and Britain and other countries in Europe were more afraid of the minds of the public being stolen by the winners. And therefore all propaganda that came out on all sides was aimed to direct the mindset of the general public who hadn't a clue. But that's what it was all about. It says here, William Colby, a future CIA director, reached the same conclusion. The communists made no secret of their belief in what they called the organizational weapon. And I started off the show talking about the fact the people down below, the masses, who are probably the most enlightened slaves that's ever existed with more information, there's no organization amongst them. It says the communists made no secret of their belief in what they called the organizational weapon, organized the party as the key command troop, but then organized all the other fronts. The women's groups, the cultural groups, the trade unions, the farmer groups, the cooperatives, a whole panoply of organizations so that you can include as many of the people in the country as possible within those groups and thereby under basically communist leadership and even discipline. While the US and its think tanks, and it mentions in here the CFR too, being one of them, realized that they would have to outsmart the communists. At least that's what they tell us. Remember, the whole project, as you go further back in history, was to get the dialectic going between two sides. But the East and the West, it was very clear cut. And out of the end of it, according to the foundations, and the good book to read is Foundations, Their Power and Influence, from the Rees Commission, that was done in the 1950s with Senator Dodd, who had to investigate how the big foundations and why the big foundations seemed to be sponsoring what seemed to be the most fervent communist groups. Because the CIA, it seems, did create some of the most left-wing groups of all. Therefore, those who were inclined to go left-wing would join their groups instead. That's quite the plan. And they came up with the idea of promoting what the Soviet system hated and called the Americans, promoting what they called decadence through the arts. That was the visual arts, drama, music, painting, altering the culture completely, and also through the novels that would get churned out like crazy. And which they did, it definitely did affect everyone who grew up in the so-called Cold War. Remember, in the Cold War too, the people weren't taking it serious enough in a lot of the countries. It was Bernays who came up with the idea, Bernays that I mentioned last week. He came up with the idea of training the children to get under their tables in the classroom to get it home to them that this was real, to make them afraid. It says here, the directive concluded that practical and ideological considerations both impel us to the conclusion that we have no choice but to demonstrate the superiority of the idea of freedom by its constructive application. Truth also needs propaganda, the philosopher Karl Jaspers had recently declared. Here was the mandate which authorized America's cold warriors to take constructive measures to ensure that the truth triumphed over deceit. The budgetary provisions set out by NSC-68 revealed the importance now given to this task. In the next 2 years, the $34 million spent on psychological warfare in 1950 was to be quadrupled. That's when they really took over the entire culture industry of the West. And they set up branches in every country throughout Europe and Scandinavia and ran them. They ran the cultures. It says here, in the contest for men's minds, truth can be peculiarly the American weapon, Secretary of State Edward Barrett announced. It cannot be an isolated weapon because the propaganda of truth is powerful only when linked with concrete actions and policies. A highly skillful and substantial campaign of truth is an indispensable as an air force. You meant propaganda, though. And truth, like the century, was to belong to America. That's what they called it, the New American Century. If deceit needed to be used to promote the truth, then so be it. That's what Arthur Kessler called fighting against a total lie in the name of a half-truth. The purpose of the IOD, said Braden, was to unite intellectuals against what was being offered in the Soviet Union. And I'll go into this because it's very interesting. It's quite a deep book, and there's lots of facts in it. The techniques used during the Cold War, and we've got to keep in mind that if the CIA was running the cultural industry right up until the Berlin Wall fell down, they would never give it up afterwards. In other words, they're still running it. The author of this particular book did a lot of research and she tried to get information from the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act. She was told that even the few questions she'd asked and access to some documents would cost up to $30,000. So she had to go into private archives from people who'd been in the CIA and get access to this kind of data. As I say, remember, this book pertains also to not only to where we are today, how we got here, but where they're going, because this is the most powerful tool ever. You are, in a sense, your culture. Whatever culture is given to you, you are it. You're in it. You dress like it. You sing the songs of it. You talk about the novels that are churned out. You talk about all the different things that captivate your mind, like everyone else around you. It's all churned out by the culture industry, because it's a battle, as I say, for the mind. You control people through the information, through the data you give to them. Remember what Brzezinski said, the public will shortly be unable to think for themselves. He said that in the 1970s. That's what's happened. They feed us the data, we parrot it to each other. We all think we're normal because we're all talking about the same things all the time.
President, earlier this year you told us you had ordered your administration to cease and desist on payments to journalists to promote your agenda. You cited the need for ethical concerns and the need for a bright line between the press and the government. Your administration continues to make the use of video news releases, which are prepackaged news stories sent to television stations, fully aware that some or many of these stations will air them without any disclaimer that they are produced by the government. Comptroller General of the United States this week said that raises ethical questions. Does it raise ethical questions about the use of government money to produce stories about the government that wind up being aired with no disclosure that they were produced by the government?
There's a Justice Department opinion that says these pieces are within the law so long as they're based upon facts, not advocacy. And I expect our agencies to adhere to that ruling, to that Justice Department opinion. It's been a long-standing practice of the federal government to use these types of videos. Agricultural Department, as I understand, has been using these videos for a long period of time. The Defense Department, other departments have been doing so. It's important that they be based on the guidelines set out by the Justice Department. Now, I think it'd be helpful if local stations then disclose to their viewers if that's, that this was based upon a factual report and they chose to use it. But evidently in some cases that's not the case. So anyway.
Guarantee that's happening by including that language in the prepackaged report.
Yeah, oh, you mean a disclosure from George W. Bush and I?
Well, some way to make sure it couldn't air without the disclosure that you believe is so vital.
Ken, I mean, there's a procedure that we're going to follow, and local stations ought to, if there's a deep concern about that, ought to tell their viewers what they're watching.
In consumer news, economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some of the spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take the spring out of the step of the Easter Bunny.
And there are specific areas and different age groups they target. They have one for every age group. It says here, the purpose of the IOD, said Braden, was to unite intellectuals against what was being offered in the Soviet Union. The idea that the world would succumb to a kind of fascist or Stalinist concept of art and literature and music was a horrifying prospect. We wanted to unite all the people who were artists, who were writers, who were musicians, and all the people who followed those people to demonstrate that the West and the United States was devoted to freedom of expression and to intellectual achievement without any rigid barriers as to what you must write and what you must say, and what you must do and what you must paint, which was what was going on in the Soviet Union. I think we did it damn well, said Braden. And at that time, when the world was being turned upside down, all this weird art would come out. And people would think it was all the left-wingers that were doing it. It wasn't. It was the CIA teams that were doing this. They hired novelists, and it says in the book too, that many of whom would never have made it on their own. And artists that had been starving because no one would buy their arts. They made them famous. And they promoted nihilism. Nihilism. Tie that in with what Bertrand Russell said, who was also part of this group as well. He said, to control people, you must create a form of apathy. And that's what nihilistic art is designed to do. It says here they use certain agencies too. It was to provide independent support for the American foreign policy objectives, which sought to promote a united Europe. That was their policy, a united Europe. That was also part of the deal with the Lend-Lease program at the end of World War II. Eisenhower said that most of this money would have to go towards the working and setup of a united Europe. Here we are today. Folk lived through that whole period until not too long ago they admitted they now had a European Parliament. Yet for years they denied they were working towards that. It was just to do with trade, they said. NATO and the European movement, the latter being substantially endowed by the CIA. So they paid for all that. The US taxpayer paid for all that and didn't know. Which included a reunified Germany. That's happened now too. It was to act as an emissary for the achievements of American culture and to work to undermine the negative stereotypes prevalent in Europe, especially France, about America's perceived cultural barrenness. It was to respond to negative criticism of other aspects of American democracy, including its civil rights records. On page 119, it goes into the degeneracy of it. It says the art and sculpture exhibition, this is an exhibition they put on in Europe, it says, was curated by James Johnson Sweeney, art critic and former director of New York's Museum of Modern Art, which was contracted to organize the show. Works by Matisse, Derain, Cézanne, Surratt, Chagall, Kandinsky, and others, masters of early 20th century modernism, were culled from American collections and shipped to Europe on 18th of April aboard the appropriately named SS Liberty. Sweeney's press release made no bones about the propaganda value of the show. As the works were created in many lands under free conditions, they would speak for themselves of the desirability for contemporary artists of living and working in an atmosphere of freedom. On display will be masterpieces that could not have been created, nor whose exhibition would be allowed by such totalitarian regimes as Nazi Germany or present-day Soviet Russia and her satellites, as has been evidenced by those governments labeling as degenerate or bourgeois of many of the paintings and sculptures included. Going through a book called The Cultural Cold War, which is a good book for the time. I'm sure that's all we'll be allowed to know because this woman has done her research, and I'm sure too that she probably was told just how far she could go and bringing out this kind of information. Remember, we always dished out information about 40 or 30 years after the events. That's pretty well standard. But as I say, keep in mind that an organization which was running the cultural industry for the whole of Europe and America would not give it up at the end of the Cold War or where the Berlin Wall went down. There was too much involved because they still had the masses to deal with. And they would not allow the masses to go off in different directions when they already had them on the same path. And that's what had happened by then. As I say, they're putting on these massive shows, these art shows across the world, all funded by the taxpayers. Art that you probably would never have bought yourself. Art that many of the painters, as I say, if they tried to sell it, would have died and they'd been destitute because no one wanted it. And the big foundations were involved because they were promoting this art as being the end thing. All the big magazines at that period were promoting this nihilistic art, and they were saying that Mrs. Rockefeller was buying it. Lots of it. It's the end thing. And that's how people are. They want to copy. If this is the end, I want it too. It was all nihilism, basically. But they did the same with the music and various other techniques as well. And churned out novels after novels by third-rate writers, made them popular. Going on to 132, page 132, it says, the fundraising arm of the Free Europe Committee was a crusade for freedom for which a young actor named Ronald Reagan was a leading spokesman and publicist. The crusade for freedom was used to launder money to support a crusade for freedom, to support a program run by Bill Casey, the future CIA director, called the International Refugee Committee in New York, which allegedly coordinated the exfiltration of Nazis from Germany into the States, where they were expected to assist the government in its struggle against communism. There's a lot of this stuff just coming out in Britain now about Britain bringing in lots of these ex-Nazis too. It was kept very quiet there. Dulles, this is the Dulles family. Dulles kept a firm grip on the committee by placing CIA officers in key positions. If a problem arose which needed to be resolved out of channels, Dulles would simply call a meeting with the committee's principals in a New York club or hotel. Top secret documents record a series of such meetings convened by Dulles at the Knickerbocker Club and the Drake Hotel, in this case in a bedroom booked for the occasion. How many Cold War campaigns were waged from hotel bedrooms? Other meetings were held in Alan Dulles or Frank Wisner's offices at CIA headquarters. The USA was a big operation, very big, said the narrator of Humboldt's gift. Commenting on the dedication of America's elite as they manned this privateer, Henry Kissinger wrote, It is to the lasting credit of that generation of Americans that they assumed these responsibilities with energy, imagination, and skill by helping Europe rebuild, encouraging European unity, shaping the institutions of economic cooperation, and extending the protection of our alliances. They saved the possibility of freedom. This is the same man now that's still trotting around the globe, pushing the same thing for this new order of things. He's all over the TVs in different countries talking about it. He's the man behind, one of the men behind this incoming president. This burst of creativity is one of the glorious moments of American history Henry Breck, a CIA case officer and alumnus of Groton School, expressed it another way. Of course, if you're in a real war, you must fight hard, and the upper classes fight the hardest. They have the most to lose. When they were not huddled together in clubs or hotel rooms, Breck's upper classes applied themselves with equal commitment to the business of entertaining. Lively, self-confident, voluble, Wisner and his colleagues were driven to enjoy a good party, just as they were driven to save the world from communism. Wisner loved to dance. He loved to do a dance called the crab communism, or crab walk. Angleton, legendary consumer of martinis, and sometimes, if anything, he could get a hold of, used to dance free-form to Elvis Presley tunes at parties, weaving enthusiastically and often by himself. And then he goes on to tell you that all of these guys, because they came from elite families, were also making a killing off this Cold War privately, because other companies and corporations were involved in the Cold War. It was a great party time. It was a great big job for them, in fact, to be honest with you. That's on page 133. And how did they organize? What did they use to organize? They used the very institutions that were already set up for world organization. On page 134 it says, the use of philanthropic foundations was the most convenient way to pass large sums of money to agency projects without alerting the recipients to their source. By the mid-1950s, the CIA's intrusion into the foundations field was massive. Although figures are not available for this period, the General Council of 1952 Congress Committee appointed to investigate U.S. foundations, as the Rees Commission, concluded that an unparalleled amount of power is concentrated increasingly in the hands of an interlocking and self-perpetuating group. Unlike the power of corporate management, it is unchecked by stockholders. Unlike the power of government, it is unchecked by the people. Unlike the power of the churches, it is unchecked by any firmly established canons of value. In 1976, a select committee appointed to investigate U.S. intelligence activities reported on the CIA's penetration of the foundation field by the mid-1960s. Now, I've been talking about these foundations for ages, and how it's all they're all interwoven in this massive system that's bringing in the New World Order under the guise of charitable foundations. And they keep adding more and more to them all the time, like the Bill Gates Foundation. It's all part of intelligence networks. They create the powerful men. They bring them up and make them powerful. Many of the big technological companies are CIA owned. You couldn't let technology get out of hand, or out of your hands into the public's hands, unless you pass it as okay. You couldn't have free enterprise in technology when they said themselves that technology and those who can create more of it will win the Cold War and the future. So whatever given at the bottom is authorized to be given to us. It says here, in 1976, a select committee appointed to investigate the U.S. intelligence activities reported the CIA's penetration of the foundation field by the mid-60s. During 63 to 66, of the 700 grants, over $10,000 given by 164 foundations, at least 108 involved partial or complete CIA funding. More importantly, CIA funding was involved in nearly half the grants made by these 164 foundations in the field of international activities during the same period. Bona fide foundations such as Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie were considered the best and most plausible kind of funding cover. A CIA study of 1966 argued that this technique was particularly effective for democratically run membership organizations, which need to assure their own unwitting members and collaborators, as well as their hostile critics, that they have genuine, respectable private sources of income. Certainly allowed the CIA to fund a seemingly limitless range of covert actions, programs affecting youth groups, labor unions, universities, publishing houses, and other private institutions from the early 1950s. There was was a cover branch at CIA whose job it was to help provide cover, like the foundations we use for operations, Braden explained. I paid no attention to the details. The finance department would handle it and talk to the cover officer. It was just a mechanism which she used. The Farfield Foundation was one of them. I don't know the names of all of them, I can't remember, but it was a crisscross of money. There was never any danger of the CIA running out of money. The crisscross of money filtered its way through a raft of host foundations. See how it works? Remember that 1,000 points of light that Bush Sr. talked about when he gave his New World Order speech? He was talking about the foundations and the NGOs they control, the non-governmental organizations.
I've spoken of 1,000 points of light, all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good. We will work hand in hand, encouraging, sometimes leading, sometimes being led, rewarding. We will work on this in the White House, in the cabinet agencies. I will go to the people and the programs that are the brighter points of light, and I'll ask every member of my government to become involved. The old ideas are new again because they're not old. They are timeless. Duty, sacrifice, commitment, and a patriotism that finds its expression in taking part and pitching in.
At the beginning of the talk, I talked about how the Soviets had one thing, and that was the perfection, the ability of organization. They could organize. And the CIA were doing exactly the same thing, using those same techniques. This goes on to say here, the crisscross of money filled its way through a raft of host foundations, some acting as front, some as conduits. Known to have wittingly facilitated CIA funding passes for over 170 foundations, including the Hoblit-Cell Foundation, which is a pass-through for the Farfield, the Litor Foundation, a donor to the Farfield, the Miami District Fund, another donor to the Farfield, the Price Fund, which was a CIA dummy, the RAB Charitable Foundation, which received CIA money from the phony Price Fund and passed it to the Farfield, the Vernon Fund, like the Farfield, a CIA dummy front with a rubber stamp board of directors, and the Whitney Trust. On their board sat the cream of America's social, financial, and political establishment. Not for nothing did these foundations announce themselves as private. Later, the joke was that if any American philanthropic or cultural organization carried the words free or private in its literature, it must be a CIA front. This was the consortium at work, calling in favors across the old school tie network, the OSS network, the boardrooms of America. The board of the Farfield Foundation alone provides a fascinating map of these intricate linkages. Junkie Fleischman, its president, was a contract consultant for Wisner's OPC, and thereafter a witting CIA cover for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. That's what they called this whole organization, a Congress for Cultural Freedom, created and funded by the CIA. But they also brought on board all the big marketers as well, the same ones who were already controlling the culture of America, mainly for profit at that time. They had to bring them on board and guide them. She says cousin Jay Holmes was president of the Holmes Foundation, incorporated in 1953 in New York. Holmes began making a small contribution to the Congress for Cultural Freedom in 1957. From 1962, the Holmes Foundation acted formally as a pass-through for CIA money to the Congress. The Fleischman Foundation, of which Junkie was president, was also listed as a donor to the Farfield Foundation. Also on the board of the Fleischman Foundation was Charles Fleischman, Junkie's nephew, who was brought onto the Farfield as a director in the early 1960s. See, it's all the old school tie. All of it. Another Farfield trustee was Cass Canfield, one of the most distinguished of American publishers. So that all the people on board, the publishing companies too. He was a director of Grosset and Dunlap, Bantam Books, and director and chairman of the editorial board of Harper Brothers. Canfield was the American publisher of The God That Failed. He enjoyed prolific links to the world of intelligence, both as a former warfare officer, a psychological warfare officer, owns big publishing companies. Think about it. As a close personal friend of Alan Dulles, whose memoirs, The Craft of Intelligence, he published in 1963. Canfield had also been an activist and fundraiser for the United World Federalists in the late 1940s. You think it was the communists who were trying to take over the world? His then president was Cord Meyer, later Tom Braden's deputy, who revealed that one technique that we used was to encourage those who were members who had influential positions in professional organizations, trade associations, or labor unions to lobby for passage at their annual conventions of resolutions favorable to a cause. I've always mentioned how you got to be careful of groups and associations that you join. And even when you start your own group up or association, it will be infiltrated. It will be. And eventually someone will rise to the top that you're all like, that will lead you off into the same direction that we're supposed to go in. And that's where we're supposed to go, is the United Nations, where we debate everything there and put it on the table. In 1954, Canfield headed up a Democratic Committee on the Arts. He was later one of the Democratic Committee founding members of ANTA, American National Theatre Academy, reactivated in 1945 as the equivalent of the Foreign Affairs branch of American theatre, alongside Jock Whitney, another partner, the CIA's quiet channels. Canfield was a friend of Frank Platt, also a Farfield director and a CIA agent. In the late 60s, Platt helped Michael Joselson. He's quite the character. He goes right through his whole personality in this book. Get a job with Canfield at Harper's. Canfield was also a trustee of the France-America Society, alongside C.D. Jackson, Grayson Kirk, president of Columbia University, David Rockefeller, and William Burden, who was its president. William Armistead Moal Burden, as well as being president of the France-America Society, was a director of the Farfield. A great-great-grandson of Commodore Vanderbilt, Burden was key presence in the American establishment. He was a member and director of the Council on Foreign Relations. Remember, the Council on Foreign Relations is a branch of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and its goal, its mandate, was to set up world government. This is a private, and here it's called a private think tank made up of America's corporate and social elites, which acted as a kind of shadow foreign policy making unit. Other members included Alan Dulles, John McCloy, and David Rockefeller. During the war, he worked for Nelson Rockefeller's intelligence outfit and sat as chairman of an advisory committee of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1956, he became president of the museum. In that year, he also sat on the State Department's Books Advisory, a Books Abroad Advisory Committee. So they were censoring books. In a sense, it's true. They were deluging the market with lots of other kind of books that was to bring down the whole culture of people across the planet. It says here, he also sat in the State Department's Books Abroad Advisory Committee. From Assistant Secretary of State for Air, he was a financier, special interest in aviation financing. Back in a moment after this break. We're cutting through the matrix, especially rushing through a book here. And this book is called The CIA and the World of Arts and Letters, The Cultural Cold Wars, by Francis Stoner, S-T-O-N-O-R, Saunders, S-A-U-N-D-E-R-S, Francis Stoner Saunders. And I'll try to get in this last little page here. Page 144. The Rockefeller Foundation, no less than the Ford, was an integral component of America's Cold War machinery. Incorporated in 1913, its principal donor was the legendary John D. Rockefeller III, with assets exceeding $500 million, not including an additional $150 million in the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Inc., a major think tank which was incorporated in New York in 1940. In 1957, the fund brought together the most influential minds of the period under a special studies project whose task was to attempt a definition of American foreign policy. Subpanel 2 was designated to the study of international security objectives and strategy. Remember, too, they're also talking, when you say international objectives and security objectives, they're talking about their own wealth taking over the resources of the planet. That should be rather self-evident. It says here, and its members included Henry and Claire Booth Lucy, Lawrence Rockefeller Townsend Hoops, representing John Jock Whitney's company, Nelson Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, Frank Lindsay, and William Bundy of the CIA. The convergence between the Rockefeller billions and the U.S. government exceeded even that of the Ford Foundation. John Foster Dulles and later Dean Russ both went from the presidency of the Rockefeller Foundation to become secretaries of state. So they're all in the CIA and in these foundations at the same time. They still are, by the way, the descendants. Other Cold War heavies such as John J. McCloy and Robert E. Lovett featured prominently as Rockefeller trustees. Nelson Rockefeller's central position on this foundation guaranteed a close relationship with U.S. intelligence circles. He'd been in charge of all intelligence in Latin America during the Second World War. Later, as associate in Brazil, Colonel Jai C. King became CIA chief of clandestine activities in the Western Hemisphere. When Nelson Rockefeller was appointed by Eisenhower to the National Security Council in '54, his job was to approve various covert operations. If he needed any extra information on CIA activities, he would simply ask his old friend Alan Dulles for a direct briefing. It actually says in here too, when they needed to get anyone on board anywhere, they just look up the membership list of the Council on Foreign Relations and bring them right into it. We're already passed as being safe. Page 145, as important as Nelson Rockefeller's was, so was his brother David. He controlled the donations committee of the Chase Manhattan Bank Foundation, was vice president, then president of the bank itself, a trustee of the Council on Foreign Relations, chairman of the executive committee for International House, and a close personal friend of Alan Dulles and Tom Braden. I often briefed David semi-officially and with Alan's permission on what we were doing, recalled Braden, who was of the same mind as us and very approving of everything we were doing. In the same sense as I did, that the way to win the Cold War was our way. Sometimes David would give me money to do things which weren't in our budget. So here's Rockefellers literally paying the agents to do operations which were black ops outside their budget. The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders. Excellent book to show you how it's done. And by the way, it's still being done. And that's the end of the show for tonight. So I'm Alan Watts. And so from Hamish, myself, Ontario, Canada, it's good night. And may your God or your gods go with you. Yesterday I was reading from a book called The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders. Excellent book, although it doesn't tell all of the story. You never get all of the story in one book. Basically, this author starts with the founding of the OSS, which split off into the CIA during the Cold War. And she doesn't go into the fact that there already were organizations running the Anglo-American establishment before the OSS was created. But she does reveal a lot of good information. She's done a lot of homework. She's done a lot of studies and archives to get this information that's scattered all over the place. And she tells you, basically, how the culture was created by the CIA, who was given responsibility for spreading a particular type of culture across the whole of Europe. And they set up offices in London and in France and in the Scandinavian countries and all of this kind of stuff. And basically, for an outsider, it would seem to be a form of retaliation against the communist regime. The communist regime was at that time giving to the workers. They were trying to introduce opera and ballet and this kind of stuff. They looked upon the West as being decadent. And therefore the idea, supposedly, was to create a form of decadence, but also completely alter the culture of the Western countries in the process. They funded artists that could never make a living outside a mental hospital. They funded authors that could never get a novel sold. They were so poor. They made them stars, some of them. They brought on board a good part of the Frankfurt School. They also brought on board a lot of the Trotskyites as well. Why on earth the CIA and MI6 be using Trotskyites until you go into the history of Trotsky and who funded Trotsky and why he fled the coup from Russia? And I will be going into that in later talks. Getting back to this book, The Cultural Cold War, they talk about novels. Now, who would think about novels? Novels shape your mind. It's a great tool for shaping the mind, mainly before TV and even afterwards. The futurists, for instance, wrote science fiction, describing a whole change through society down through ages. And I'll bet you anything, some of the big sci-fi writers like Arthur C. Clarke were members of it. Guaranteed. Because they shape our minds. We grow up thinking in possibilities. They introduce the possibilities through their novels, and then when the real things start to occur in real life, we think it's quite natural. It's called predictive programming. On page 244 of this book it says, in the mid-50s, 1950s, far from diminishing the CIA's presence in the cultural life of the period, and now increased. From New York, Lawrence to Novel, up to Joselson. Joselson, by the way, was put in charge of this big area they called Congress for Cultural Freedom. They love doublespeak, don't they? This is with ideas for discussion in Encounter. They run all the magazines. They even funded and started up magazines and put their own agents in as the head editors. It's astonishing. And it says here, with ideas for discussion and Encounter, including a piece on the subject of the conscience of the individual versus the requirements of hierarchy, which Josephson recommended to Spender and Crystal. They presumably were ignorant of the special interest Josephson had in the intricacies of such a subject. Very important subject, isn't it? The individual versus the requirements of hierarchy. Other agency men were unable to resist the pull of the pen. Jack Thompson, these are all agents. Jack Thompson continued to write for scholarly journals like the Hudson Review. In 1961, he published The Founding of English Meter, a brilliant study of English poetry. Robbie Macaulay wrote for Kenyon Review, The New Republic, the Irish University Review, Partisan Review, and the New York Times Book Review. During his tenure at the CIA, he continued to write fiction, notably The Disguises of Love and The End of Pity and other stories. If you go into Arthur Koestler and the writings of him, his novels, he was also funded by this organization via MI5 and MI6. London firm of Hodder and Stoughton published a book on Afghanistan by Edward S. Hunter, another CIA operative who used the cover of a freelance writer. That's very common. You travel all over the world that way. And roamed Central Asia for years, gathering intelligence, you see. Frederick Prager, a propagandist for the American military government in post-war Germany, published between 20 and 25 volumes in which the CIA had an interest, either in the writing, the publication itself, or the distribution. Prager said they either reimbursed him directly for the expenses of publication or guaranteed, usually through a foundation, the big foundations again, the purchase of enough copies to make it worthwhile. Do you remember Bill Clinton's supposed autobiography was a bestseller before it was printed? Remember? Books differ from all other propaganda media, wrote Chief of the CIA's Covert Action Staff, primarily because one single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and action to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium, such as to make books the most important weapon of strategic, long-range propaganda. The CIA's clandestine books program was run according to the same source with the following aims in mind: get books published or distributed abroad without revealing any U.S. influence by covertly subsidizing foreign publications or booksellers, get books published which should not be contaminated by any overt tie-in with the U.S. government, especially if the position of the author is delicate, get books published for operational reasons, regardless of commercial viability, so it didn't matter if it's a dud book. Initiate and subsidize indigenous, national or international organizations for book publishing or distributing purposes. They set up most of the big international organizations that are at the front today. Remember the 1,000 points of light I keep talking about, the NGOs that George Bush Sr. mentioned in his New World Order speech. Stimulate the writing of politically significant books by unknown foreign authors, either by directly subsidizing the author, if covert contact is feasible, or indirectly through literary agents or publishers. The New York Times alleged in 1977 that the CIA had been involved in the publication of at least 1,000 books. But it's astonishing, you see. They also went to the movie industry as well, but continue with the books here, to do with what they call pen. It says, page 366, having scored a victory at the Bled Congress, John Hunt started preparing for the next PEN conclave. That's the World Association of Writers, PEN. Due to take place in New York the following June. This would be the first time in 42 years that the American Center played host to an international PEN Congress. With stakes this high, the CIA decided to bring out the full battery of its covert arsenal. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, for one, was to play a significant role. It had already given £1,000 actually to Carver in June '65 to start organizing the New York campaign, which was fine-tuned over lunch with Hunt at the Chanterelle restaurant on Brompton Road. The Ford Foundation made a timely intervention, awarding American PEN a substantial grant, $75,000, in January '66, and the Rockefeller Foundation coughed up an additional $25,000. The CIA also channeled money to American PEN through the Asia Foundation and the Free Europe Committee. With such investments at stake, John Hunt wrote to David Carver on 9th of February '66, telling him that he thought it wise to try and limit their liability. So everything you read too, you see, that which grabs your spirit and carries you away into great realms, is put out by these guys. You wouldn't want people to have their own ideas and go off in different directions that may be contrary to your agenda, your plan. So you make sure you fill their heads full of your fiction, that your fiction was programmed to take them along a particular path of programming. That's why they call television programming as well. On page 287, movies, like propaganda, trade in fiction, but if this fiction is adroitly manufactured, it will be taken for reality. To perform this function well, Hollywood had long understood the need to cut its mythical patterns to suit the prevailing political and social mood. I've mentioned the movie before. It's called Hollywoodism. It's quite fantastic. If you want to see the power of movies, try and get the series from the CBC, main broadcasting corporation. It's called Sin Cities. It's fantastic to show you how a few people with an idea can alter the whole of society. As Hollywood had long undertaken its need to cut its mythical patterns to suit prevailing political and social mood, thus it had switched from making anti-Bolshevik films in the 1920s and 30s to glorifying Russia as a wartime ally. That's how fast they can change a society's opinion of people they've never even met and probably never will meet. Because they had a little anti-Bolshevist propaganda prior to the 20s and the 30s. But then when Russia was becoming the ally during World War II, suddenly when the action, Russia was a good guy. Who we fight today, or will East Asia or West Asia be back after these messages? And talking about Hollywood and how the CIA basically were directing Hollywood. And I will be going deeper after this talk into history to show you it isn't just the CIA. But this is to do with their involvement in creating the culture from the 50s on for the Western world. And it said, Hollywood thus has switched from making anti-Bolshevik films in the 20s and 30s to glorifying Russia as a wartime ally in films such as The North Star, Days of Glory, Song of Russia, and the notorious Mission to Moscow, which had actually whitewashed the Moscow trials and praised the Russians as defenders of democracy, to producing a rash of anti-communist films in the 1950s, such as The Red Nightmare, The Red Menace, Invasion USA, I Was a Communist for the FBI, Red Planet Mars, Iron Curtain, My Son John, Invasion of Body Snatchers, Walk East on Beacon Street, which was scripted and financed by the FBI, was J. Edgar Hoover's personal favorite. Their titles as unconvincing as their plots, these films all revealed a neurotic obsession with the outsider, the unknown, the other. That puts me in mind of that military think tank's projection for the future called Known Unknowns. So I was looking at known unknowns as they feed all data into computers and wait for the results. So just as Captain America has switched from battling Nazis to battling communists, the attitude of American films towards Germany changed radically. The vanquished enemy now portrayed as heroic fighters and worthy opponents, such as Rommel, the Desert Fox, 52, The Sea Chase, The Enemy Below, etc. As Monday's enemies became Tuesday's friends, Hollywood showed how easy it could rip off the good and evil labels from one nation and paste them on another. And that's exactly what Orwell was saying in his book 1984, where when the government says, we're now at war with East Asia, we've always been at war with East Asia, you better start parting it too. But it's not too hard because the public really don't have much memory. They don't. And that's what they count on. It's interesting, that ties right in with surveys done in Canada to do with the war on Iraq. And even though all the same medias blamed initially one man in a cave in Afghanistan, poll surveys were done by big polling companies, and they said that within a few months the media, when told basically, had convinced the public that the originator of the plot was Saddam Hussein, and they all wanted to back up the American invasion of Iraq. That's how easy it was, just through propaganda and repetition, to change sides from one enemy to another. It's always been that way. While such films played well to a domestic audience and trawl to exaggerate claims of the communist menace, most Americans were now convinced that the Russians were coming and the bomb would soon fall in the night. Remember I told you Bernays was involved in it? They brought all these boys on board, you see, because it was a war for the minds. They needed people who understood the psychology of the masses. Very old science, actually. It wasn't new at all. It says, in the international market, they were poor performers. For a Europe still wounded by the memories of fascism, the insensate hatred and verbal violence of Hollywood's anti-communist offerings were unattractive in the extreme. Faring better were Disney's cartoons and feel-good films such as Roman Holiday and The Wizard of Oz. But not all Europeans were seduced by these fictive paradises. Buried deep in the clauses of successive trade agreements, starting with the Blum-Burns Accord of 1946, were provisions which guaranteed an increase in the quota of American films shown in countries such as France. Such agreements were met with indignant criticism in French intellectual circles, and even in 1948 led to violent street battles. Now in the 60s, the Royal Institute for International Affairs had a meeting in Britain with the CFR, its American branch, and it was in the newspapers at the time. Their whole purpose was to do with deciding who, the US or Britain, should be given the lead in creating the world's culture. The world's culture, because they knew they were working towards, if you've read their own books that they publish themselves, they've always been working towards a world government. And they decided at the time in those meetings that most would be given to the US. That ties right in with this book. It says here, American strategists were surprisingly slow to respond to widespread resentment in Europe at the saturation levels of Hollywood imports. There was no diplomatic representation at the 1951 Cannes Film Festival, nor any formal delegation of American motion picture leaders, writers, technicians, or artists. By contrast, the Russians had sent their Deputy Minister of Cinema, as well as a renowned director, Podovkin, who gave a brilliant resume of Soviet achievements. After receiving reports that America had looked very silly at Cannes, the US government resolved to give the motion picture industry more attention. On 23rd of April 1953, after his appointment as special consultant to the governor on cinema, Cecil B. DeMille strode into C.D. Jackson's office. Writing to Henry Luce 2 weeks later, DeMille said DeMille is very much on our side. I was quite really impressed with the power of American films abroad. Back with more after this break, giving out some information of how culture is produced and implemented on the publics of the world. And sometimes it's tailor-made. You'll look at your culture and you'll see what differences there are in your makeup, your cultural makeup, and alter it to suit. And this part here of the Cultural Cold War is talking about Hollywood. And one of the people who were helping the CIA here, if not working right for them, was Cecil B. DeMille. And he says here, he has a theory to which I subscribe completely, that the most effective use of American films is not to design an entire picture to cope with a certain problem, but rather to see to it that in a normal picture, the right line, aside, inflection, eyebrow movement, and so on is introduced. He told me that any time I could give him a simple problem for a country or an area, he would find a way of dealing with it in a picture. DeMille's acceptance of consultancy with the Motion Picture Service was a coup for government propagandists. Working through 135 United States Information Service posts in 87 countries, the MPS had a huge distribution network to hand. Awash with government funds, it was effectively a producer with all the facilities available to a production company. It employed producer directors who were given top security clearance and assigned to films which articulated the objectives which the United States is interested in obtaining and which could best reach the predetermined audience that we as a motion picture medium must condition. It advised secret bodies like the Operations Coordinating Board on films suitable for international distribution. I don't know if people realize that even back then, one of the biggest exports of the United States was Hollywood movies. Still is. In June '54, it listed 37 films for showing behind the Iron Curtain, including Peter Pan, The Jolson Story, The Glenn Miller Story, The Boy from Oklahoma, Roman Holiday, Little Women, Showboat, The Cane Mutiny, Go Man Go, which is a history of Harlem Globetrotters, Alice in Wonderland, and Executive Suite. The NPS also regulated American participation in film festivals abroad, thus filling the embarrassing vacuum of the 1951 Cannes Festival. Naturally, it worked hard to exclude American motion picture producers and films which do not support American foreign policy. And remember, the foreign policy is often a policy which the American people have no idea of. They scream if they did, which in some cases are harmful from being shown at international festivals. Instead, it pushed films like the Bob Mathias story, Allied Artists 54, an almost perfect portrayal of the best phase of American life. Almost perfect portrayal, not a reality. A small-town boy with his family, his sweetheart, his career, his interest in sports, all building up to his two-time triumphs as one of the outstanding athletes in the history of the Olympics. If it hasn't got the American values we want on the screen, then we have to go start looking for a new set of values to publicize. It's amazing, eh? In the search for allies in Hollywood who best understood the propaganda problems of the US and who were prepared to insert in their scripts and in their action the right ideas with the proper subtlety, C.D. Jackson, as usual, was embarrassed for choice. In January '54, he set down a list of friends who could be expected to help the government. He listed Cecil B. DeMille, Spiros P. Skouras and Daryl Zanuck at Fox, Nicholas Schenk, president of MGM, and producer Dory Sherry, Barney Balaban, president of Paramount, Harry and Jack Warner, James R. Granger, president of the RKO, Universal's president, Milton Racknell, Columbia Pictures president, Harry Kahn, Herbert Yates at Republic, Walt and Roy Disney, and Eric Johnson of the Motion Picture Association. But CD's most valuable asset in Hollywood was CIA agent Carlton Alsop, A-L-S-O-P. Working undercover at Paramount Studios, Alsop had been a producer and agent working on the MGM lot in the mid-1930s, then with Judy Garland in the late 1940s and early 50s, by which time he had already joined Frank Wisner's psychological warfare workshop. I mean, here's all these people completely trained in not only Bernays techniques, but even deeper stuff to do with warfare, because everything to them at the top is war, constant war. And they're in charge of the movie industry. They're in charge of the novel industry. They're in charge of the music industry. Everything that gives you culture. And they're also deciding what fashions you'll wear at the same time, and what topics you'll prattle on about in the street, what fads you'll go through collectively, as they claim to be spreading democracy. Weird schmucks, eh? It says, Psychological Warfare, Psychological Strategy Board. These reports were compiled in response to a double need: first, to monitor communists and fellow travelers in Hollywood, and second, to summarize the achievements and failures of a covert pressure group headed up by Carlton Alsop, charged with introducing specific themes into Hollywood films. Do you realize how much money Hollywood has spent since they started Gulf War I to the present on war movies? The Pentagon funds them. Also, young guys will get all romantic about war, thinking that they're indestructible and they're fighting the bad guys regardless. They'll find all the camaraderie they ever wanted and didn't have before amongst their brethren, because all of these groups are fraternities. The military is a fraternity. Of course it is. You bond with them. And here they are, churning out fiction to get folk to join up. It's either that or the draft. It says here, Alsop's secret reports make extraordinary reading. They reveal just how far the CIA was able to extend its reach into the film industry, despite its claims that it sought no such influence. One report dated 24th of January 1953 concentrated on the problem of black stereotyping in Hollywood. Under the heading Negroes in Pictures, Alsop reported that he had secured the agreement of several casting directors to plant well-dressed Negroes as a part of the American scene without appearing too conspicuous or deliberate. Astonishing. Everyone gets used, you know. Even names on the movies they put them in, including some by Jerry Lewis, such as Caddy and so on. Caddy is C-A-D-D-Y. And it goes on and on and on. But remember, this book is giving out stuff that obviously the public are allowed to know, if they care to. Most don't, because the past to a young person at 18, even in the 50s, to the 50s, if you're living today, it's like antique history. It's got nothing to do with you. That's the failure of youth. They don't realize the importance of all of this. Incredible importance, because you see, they were controlling it after the 50s and 60s and 70s too, and a lot of that's in that book as well. They used the folk industry, the folk singing industry as well. And a lot of people thought it was left-wingers running the folk industry, folk singers. Then they went into the transitory stage between folk and electric guitar. And then they went into the rock business. I've talked before about that canyon in LA where so many of them came out of. All the musicians, the big big musicians, Laurel Canyon. And I had links on my sites, on one of the programs I did, to someone who's compiling a lot of the history of the big artists of the period. They all belonged to long military families. Military families, high ones, too. So the guys who were chasing around and trying to emulate were brought up in the best schools, private schools, for the establishment, grew their hair long, and came out to be radicals. So everyone followed them thinking we'd all be radicals. Because there's a much bigger game plan ahead, you see. There's nothing to do with fighting communism and all that kind of stuff at all. In fact, communism was funded from its inception by the West and fed right through its existence, mainly from the breadbasket of Canada and the US. Canada and the US used to compete for the orders for Russia. I used to be in the papers all the time. Remember that other article I read from the US military magazine that said we shall go on using our degeneracy to captivate the world because they like our degeneracy, and if they don't, we'll make them like it, and we can't lose. Tie that in with what they were doing during the Cold War and what the Russians were accusing them of doing. Remember, at the top of Russia and at the top of the US, there was a coordination. Remember, too, that the Rees Commission said that they were, when you examined the big foundations, a lot of them are in this book, actually, these foundations. Senator Dodd was told their purpose was to blend the Soviet system seamlessly with that of the West. We have that today. That's the dialectic in action. That's how it works. You need an opposite to build up your forces, to change the people at home too. Remember what Professor Carla Quigley said, wars are intended to change the cultures of the opposing parties. And it does. And governments grow incredibly large because of wars. Whether it's a Cold War or otherwise, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You have to go back and back into history to find out who was already operating on this level before the CIA, before OSS. Who had the abilities, who had the setup, who was already using and had funded and set up foundations for a global society. Now remember, I said the OSS office during World War II, and you'll find that in Professor Carl Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope. Their headquarters was Chatham House. Chatham House is the head. It was before and still is World War II. It was the head for the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which is the British CFR. The Royal Institute for International Affairs is a private think tank, we're told. It's into everything, hundreds of different things across the planet, including your food supply. It came out from an organization, two organizations actually, that were working for the British elite. One was the Cecil Rhodes Foundation and the Lord Alfred Milner Foundation, both sworn to bring in a form of world government based on Britain. They backed and set up the League of Nations, which was the precursor of the United Nations, and they're behind the UN too. That's who had all of these techniques. They're already using these techniques before World War II, before the OSS, before the CIA came along. Who was Professor Carl Quigley? He wasn't just a professor. He's professor of history at the Foreign Service School of Georgetown University, the Foreign Service School. Formerly taught at Princeton and Harvard. He's done research in archives of France, Italy, and England. He's the author of the widely praised Evolution of Civilizations, a member of the editorial board of the monthly Current History. He's a frequent lecturer and consultant for public and semi-public agencies. Public and semi-public agencies. Very important, semi-public. He's a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Anthropological Association, and the American Economic Association, as well as various historical associations. He's been lecturer on Russian history at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces since '51, and on Africa at the Brookings Institution since '61. He's lectured in many other places, including the U.S. Naval's Weapons Laboratory, the Foreign Service Institute of the State Department, and the Naval College at Norfolk, Virginia. In '58, he was a consultant to the Congressional Select Committee, which set up the present National Space Agency. Collaborator in history to the Smithsonian Institution after '57, in connection with the establishment of the New Museum of History and Technology. In '64, he went to the Navy Postgraduate School, Monterey, California, as consultant to Project Seabed, where he's trying to visualize what American weapon systems would be like in 12 years. Now, you can know yourself, he's part of the groups I've been talking about in the Cultural Cold War. But what else was he? He knew Alfred Zimmerman. Alfred Zimmerman ran the communist newspapers for Britain. Winston Churchill supposedly hated communism, yet it was the right-hand aide to Winston Churchill, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Zimmerman was the man who brought Professor Carl Quigley in as the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations. They have their own historian. Now, I've warned people before, if you join groups, the chances are you've been led up the garden path. If you join a side or a group, be blinded to the big picture, because what you want to hear in that group will be supplied to you along with disinformation, and you'll never see that you're being used. And these guys are specialists at creating big groups. If they don't create it, they'll take it over because they love it. Why not? It's already ready-made for you. Put your man at the top. You control the minds of thousands, sometimes millions. Professor Quigley was the man who picked lots of people to be Rhodes Scholars and send them off to Oxford, England. Bill Clinton was one of them, only one of them. There's many of them. What does Quigley say about left-wing, right-wing, and so on? In his own book, Tragedy and Hope, on page 949, he describes how the left-wing will see what's happening in the world through all the big movements and blame the communists. He'll go into the other side too, and how the other side will see the right-wing controlling things. And he goes on in 950 to say this myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. It does exist and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network. And I'll continue this, it's very important, after this break. Just discussing a little bit from Tragedy and Hope by Professor Carl Quigley. And he's discussing how the right wing will blame the left wing for what they see happening in their culture, and vice versa. For the other wing, you see, if you belong to a group, you're being manipulated. 950, page 950, this guy who studied the records of the Council on Foreign Relations says this myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. Remember, he was a historian for them. He went into their records department. There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. In fact, it loves groups, you see. It says, I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years, and was permitted for 2 years in the early 60s to examine its papers and secret records. He says, I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it, you're darn right it was, and to many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, notably to the belief that England was an Atlantic rather than a European power, and must be allied or even federated with the United States, and must remain isolated from Europe. And that's all altered because the real plan was for a global establishment. But in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. The roundtable groups have already mentioned in this book several times, notably in connection with the formation of the British Commonwealth. The British Commonwealth was to be the nucleus, since it was already established, of a new world order. A new world order, widely discussed, in fact, at the League of Nations and setting up of the United Nations. They would use the existing British Commonwealth as the setup, the model. They would expand it to be a global system. It says, the American branch of this organization, sometimes called the Eastern Establishment, has played a very significant role in the history of the United States in the last generation. Roundtable groups were semi-secret discussion and lobbying groups organized by Lyon Curtis, Philip Kerr, who was Lord Lothian in Britain. Lord Lothian, by the way, who was head of the Royal Institute for International Affairs in Britain, was who Mr. Hess visited when he took the Messerschmitt over to Britain to ask why they'd double-crossed Germany. It says, this was done on behalf of Lord Milner, the dominant trustee of the Rhodes Trust, in the 2 decades before up to 1925. The original purpose of these groups was to seek to federate the English-speaking world along lines laid down by Cecil Rhodes and William T. Stead, and the money for their organizational work came originally from the Rhodes Trust, the Rhodes Foundation, merged with the Milner Trust and Foundation, and then it became the Royal Institute for International Affairs. The American branch is the Council on Foreign Relations, set up by a member, Mr. Pratt. And they've been running the system and been behind the wars ever since. They had the parallel government that Mrs. Thatcher said she now belonged to. I'll be back with more tomorrow.